Chapter 2, Almost Impossible to Convey. The year was 1875, and in America there was a call in the air, the call of revolution. The War of Independence had overthrown the forces of monarchy and aristocracy in the United States. 7 years later, the Civil War brought an end to the peculiar institution of slavery. It was now time for the trilogy to come to its moral and logical conclusion with the overthrow of the exploitative capitalist class and the installation of a socialist system based upon liberty, equality, and brotherhood. The end of the 19th century had brought a tide of wretched refuse from Europe, huddled masses eager to find a better life for themselves and their families. These marginalized people, the lowest of the low, even where they had come from, brought their fringe ideologies with them. It stood to reason that those who had been completely diminished by the systems of the day would regard those systems as not just bad, but as downright malevolent. At the time, the terms socialist, communist, and anarchist were used somewhat loosely and interchangeably because the prophesied Marxist society was one in which the state had famously withered away. There was great disagreement about what a socialist system would look like in practice, but two things were clear. First, that socialism was both inevitable and scientific, the way of the future. Second, that the capitalist ruling class were not going down without a fight. The Second Amendment states that the right to bear arms shall not be infringed and ties this right to a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The immigrant socialist groups took such rights seriously, for the poverty-stricken masses had little else to their name. In Chicago, a group of German Americans incorporated themselves as the Lehr- und Wehrverein, Education and Defense Society, and began training as a militia. They had the guns and they had the will. They practiced in order to be prepared for when the proletarian revolution finally began. They were Americans. Revolution was their heritage. The Illinois state legislature thus passed a law in 1879 that decreed that militias had to have a license. Shall not be infringed. The Lehr- und Wehrverein sued on Second Amendment grounds and were defeated all the way up to the highest court. Their hope was that the Supreme Court would affirm the Second Amendment right to allow private citizens to form militias. After all, was not America herself the product of the common man forming militias and revolting against the British? Just as the poor sans-culottes of the later French Revolution, Washington's army was so hard up for materiel that they were often shoeless. Supreme Court did not agree. The 1886 Presser versus Illinois Supreme Court case established that state legislatures may enact statutes to control and regulate all organizations, drilling, and parading of military bodies and associations except those which are authorized by the militia laws of the United States. It further stated that the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution limited only the power of Congress and the national government to control firearms, not the states. In a bizarre twist of history, one of the earliest restrictions of the Second Amendment was against the militant left. The Supreme Court decision may have seemed on its face to be a decision in favor of law and order and against political violence, but if anything, it simply changed the form of revolutionary fervor among the socialists. Militias? That was so 18th century. The Industrial Revolution was underway, and that entailed a new, modern form of violence to bring about the socialist future. Decades before Ayn Rand was born, a man named Alfred Nobel had also spent his youth in her native St. Petersburg. As a teenager, he was sent by his father to France to apprentice with a chemist. There, he befriended one Ascanio Sobrero, who had discovered a substance that he called pyroglycerin. Like many other revolutionary discoveries, pyroglycerin was found largely due to a combination of an accident and a quality mind that deduced what the hell had just happened. Swiss chemistry professor Christian Friedrich Schonbein had been experimenting with nitric and sulfuric acid. Spilling some by mistake, he wiped the liquid away with his wife's cotton apron. Yet when he went to dry the apron by the fire, it vanished in a flash in a virtual spontaneous combustion. Adding the cotton cellulose to the acid mixture had somehow created a new substance with highly unusual properties. It was Sobrero's idea to try and substitute glycerin for the cellulose due to chemical similarities between the two compounds. What he found
is the white pill, Michael Malice,
not only burned but was downright explosive. It was as nitroglycerin that Sobrero's discovery would come to be known worldwide, but nitroglycerin was not particularly stable or safe by itself. Nobel personally knew how dangerous nitroglycerin can be. In 1864, his younger brother Emil had died at the age of 20 from an explosion that came about from experimenting with the substance. It fell upon Nobel to invent a mercury fulminate blasting cap to ensure that the nitroglycerin would only detonate when desired. He also mixed nitroglycerin with diatomaceous earth in order to give it some stability and make it safe for transport. Nobel envisioned dynamite being used for mining, saving laborers an enormous amount of time from digging through solid rock. Yet for many, the deadliness of Nobel's dynamite was not a hazard, but a selling point. To his unmitigated horror, dynamite was quickly adopted as a weapon of war. If dynamite could blow up a boulder in a mine, imagine what it could do to an enemy platoon. It was to this that many in the anarchist wing of socialism put their hopes. It was a German anarchist named Johann Most who made that context of the revolutionary class struggle, realizing that dynamite was an invention that would irrevocably alter the calculus of political violence. Born in Germany, Most had developed untreatable frostbite on his face as a boy. This somehow turned into cancer, and a chunk of his jawbone had to be removed to save his life. No matter, beards were fashionable at the time, and Most covered his disfigurement accordingly. It was
No.
Most who took the politics of violence into new directions.
Not my doing either.
What he called the
I think she had a change of heart.
deed, the idea that murder could be a useful technique to ensure given ends. Rather than being ashamed of such violence, the revolutionary should boast about his actions. As Most wrote in 1885, the great thing about anarchist vengeance is that it proclaims loud and clear for everyone to hear that this man or that man must die for this and that reason, and that at the first opportunity which presents itself for the realization of such a threat, the rascal in question is really and truly dispatched to the other world.
This is just the
In order
second
to achieve
chapter,
the
so
desired success in the fullest measure, immediately after the action has been carried out, especially in the town where it took place, posters should be put up setting out the reasons for the action in such a way as to draw from them the best possible benefit. For Most, enthusiasm and revolutionary fervor were all well and good, but what is to be done? Rhetorical bomb throwing was dangerous enough. Literal bomb throwing was something else altogether. Most published a pamphlet translated to English as The Science of Revolutionary Warfare. The subtitle made no bones about the purpose of the work. A little handbook of instruction, the use and preparation of nitroglycerin, dynamite, gun cotton, fulminating mercury, bombs, fuses, poisons, etc., etc. Thanks to Most, anyone could now make weapons of mass destruction from the comfort, if not exactly the safety, of their own home. Terror had become democratized, and dynamite called to young socialist extremists like a siren song. As one anarchist writer later put it, when free speech is suppressed, when men are jailed for asking food, clubbed for assembling to discuss their grievances, and stoned for expressing their opinions, there's but one recourse: violence. The ruling class has guns, bullets, bayonets, police, jails, militias, armies, and navies. To oppose all this, the worker has only dynamite. Once we are in an era when things are really happening, Most prophesied, it would be stupid to consider amateur dynamite production. Dynamite factories and explosives warehouses can be seized just like anything else. Violent revolution and the subsequent ultimate workers' victory would soon follow as day followed night. It was a few months after the 1886 Presser decision that matters came to a head. In 1867, Illinois passed a law mandating an 8-hour workday, but the law proved largely toothless. The same pattern was repeated state after state as laws were subverted or ignored. The democratic process seemed to be entirely stacked against the workers. A national strike was held on May 1st, 1886, with around 350,000 workers protesting to demand shorter hours. From that year forward, May 1st would be commemorated worldwide as a way to celebrate the accomplishments of the working class and to advocate for better conditions for laborers. Change was clearly on the horizon, but it was unclear what form it would entail. The tension between labor and capital seemed to be escalating out of everyone's control just 20 years after what had already been the bloodiest conflict that America had ever seen. The corporate press did its part to add fuel to the fire. As the New York Times opined on April 25, 1886, the strike question is of course the dominant one and is disagreeable in a variety of ways.
He's all over town,
is urged in some quarters, which is to indict for conspiracy every man who strikes and summarily lock him up. This method would undoubtedly strike a wholesome terror into the hearts of the working classes. Another way suggested is to pick out the labor leaders and make such examples of them as to scare the others into submission. On May 4th, 1886, a rally was called for Chicago's Haymarket Square. Estimates about the number of attendees varied from several hundred to a few thousand. What is in dispute is that, much to the relief of all concerned, the rally was peaceful. None of the speakers who took to the podium urged the workers to violence. Mayor Carter Harrison
I'm gonna pause it while I'm getting gas.
observed the situation, leaving, and he was satisfied that nothing out of order would occur. At around 10:30 p.m., a police inspector ordered the crowd to disperse in the name of the law. It was somewhat easy to understand why the workers had been denied their Second Amendment rights, but now they were also being denied their First Amendment right of the people peaceably to assemble. That's when someone threw a bomb. The anarchists later regarded it as the act of an agent provocateur. The police regarded it as the act of an anarchist eager to light the powder keg that would begin the workers' revolution. If it had been an anarchist, they did not take heed of Johann Most's admonition to proclaim the propaganda of the deed. As a result, to this day, no one knows who threw the explosive or why. What is known is that one police officer was killed immediately and several others received mortal wounds. Gunfire was thereupon exchanged between the police and the workers, with several more people being killed. 8 men were arrested as a consequence of the events, though their connections to the killings varied from thin to non-existent. Only 2 had even been present when the bomb had gone off, with 2 others having previously left after giving their respective speeches. Despite all this, the men were tried as a group for accessory to the murder of Officer Matthias Degen. For many Americans, it was clear that a foreign ideology dedicated to the violent overthrow of lawful authority was bearing.
All right. I'll be right back. This is chapter 2.
Someone had to pay. These individual men had preached violent terrorism.
It says 3 on the Audible, but
all 8
because
men were found guilty, 7 of them sentenced to hang, while 1 received a 15-year sentence. It was a conviction.
Okay, now it
without
says 2
precedent.
now.
They were being tarred with the radicalism of the most extreme anarchists, even though most of them spoke
Chapter
out
2.
against violence. They appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, but were denied. 2 of the men pled with Governor Oglesby for clemency, bending the knee in order to save their lives. Their petition was granted, and they would be spared the gallows. 4 of the remaining 5 men refused to beg. They had done nothing wrong and found it obscene to have to renounce their philosophy of equality and brotherhood. They refused to recognize the trials legitimate, and they pointed out that there had been no evidence presented whatsoever to connect them to the bomb throwing. Instead of hanging separately, they each decided they would all hang together, and hang they would. Of the 8, the one who would perhaps have the greatest impact on the socialist movement was a young bomb maker named Louis Ling. If Che Guevara can be regarded as a symbol of youthful rebellion to oblivious hipsters, Louis Ling far better fulfills that role for those who know their history. Almost a century and a half after his death, his most famous photograph stares at the viewer with the sizzling smolder of a contemporary male model. Even the police captain who guarded him couldn't help but muse about what a stud the young anarchist was. Many callers came to sympathize with Ling, as well as to admire his handsome physique, wrote Captain Shock. And, as he would not allow his hair to be cut after his incarceration, his flowing curly locks added to his picturesque appearance. Police officers had found bombs when they searched Ling's room after the Haymarket massacre. To address the issue as to why, his attorney weakly explained that his client had a right to have his house full of dynamite. He couldn't have thrown the bomb because he was at home making bombs. In court, Ling raged at the judge, doubling down on his ideology. I tell you frankly and openly, I am for force. I've already told Captain Shock if they use cannons against us, we shall use dynamite against them. I repeat that I'm the enemy of the order of today, and I repeat that with all my powers, as long as breath remains in me, I shall combat it. I declare again, frankly and openly, that I am in favor of using force. Perhaps you think you'll throw no more bombs, but let me assure you, I die happy on the gallows. So confident am I that the hundreds and thousands to whom I've spoken will remember my words, and when you shall have hanged us, then, mark my words, they will do the bomb throwing. In this hope do I say to you, I despise your order, your laws, your force-propped authority. Hang me for it. They would never get the opportunity to hang Ling. At one point during the men's imprisonment, a box had fallen open in a common area where they congregated, and out of it had fallen a bomb. Upon investigating the box, the officers discovered it had a false bottom containing 3 other bombs ready to be detonated at a moment's notice. Ling had said, we shall use dynamite against them, and mere days away from the gallows, he seemed ready to make good on his promise. Much like what the officers had found in Ling's home, it seemed as if this box had been made according to Ling's instructions by some handy carpenter who was a close friend. Captain Shock described Ling's reaction at being found out. It was evident from his actions that the discovery greatly troubled him. His face became almost livid with rage, his eyes fairly snapped fire, and he fumed in his cage like an imprisoned beast of prey. He was speechless with anger, and every motion betrayed an energy of passion that was fearful to behold. Thereafter, as might have been expected, Ling was more carefully watched than ever. The increased surveillance was of little use. 4 days later, one day before the men were sentenced to hang, an explosion rocked the prison from Ling's cage. Officials were soon in the cell and found Ling lying on his side on the couch, with one arm thrown over his head and the other resting on a little table. A stream of blood was coursing down the pillow, and pools of it had gathered upon the bedding. The deputies raised him up gently, a ghastly sight met their gaze.
This is
the lower jaw had been
what we're listening to.
blown away. The upper lip was completely torn to shreds.
This is The White Pill by Michael Malice. He just released it on audio. Just released it on audio. So got a bunch of Audible credits.
The greater part of his nose was in tatters, only a fragment of his tongue remained, and every vestige of front teeth had disappeared. What remained of his cheeks looked like flesh torn by vultures, and every jagged part bled profusely. The inside of his upper jaw was horribly lacerated. It looked as though no man could survive such a wound for a moment after its infliction, and yet the bomb maker was alive and breathing regularly. It's unclear how the bomb got smuggled in. Shock speculated that Ling had a confidant among those who visited him. Perhaps it was the a mysterious girlfriend who had visited him every day for the previous 4 months. In any event, Ling took his death sentence out of the hands of the state. It took him hours to die. Plenty of time for him to use his blood to write his parting words, Hoch die Anarchie, on the walls of his cell. The other men would have to wait a day to meet their maker. On November 11th, 1887, Adolf Fischer, George Engel, August Spies, and Albert Parsons were hanged. Parsons had been a journalist. He went on the lam when the news hit, but was eventually coaxed to return to Illinois to face trial, so long as his comrades were up for the same charges. The thought of the death penalty had then seemed like a complete absurdity. Parsons faced animosity his entire life, working for the Confederacy as a teenager, then turning Republican before turning anarchist. His wife Lucy was a former slave, an interracial relationship at a time where the idea of one was as radical as anarchism. "This is the happiest moment of my life," Fisher announced from the platform. Parsons forward, asking the sheriff for permission to say a few words. "Let the voice of the people be heard," he pleaded, and was then hanged before he could say anything else. The authorities had refused to let Lucy or her children see Albert as he was being killed by the state, and she was, of course, inconsolable. There are several versions of August Spies' last words. The exact phrasing of what he said is lost to history, but the underlying message was consistent across all accounts. "The day will come," he predicted, "when our silence will be more powerful than the voices you are strangling today." And this Spies was correct. A statue to the Haymarket martyrs would be erected near Chicago 6 years later, and the men would be posthumously pardoned by the governor. For them, it was far too little too late, but while this battle might have been lost, the war against the capitalist
nice political
class
move there.
An entire generation of young socialists were
Posthumously
inspired and
pardoned.
galvanized by the socialists' courage and convictions, and none more prominent than the diminutive woman known as Emma Goldman. Born in the Russian Empire in 1869, Emma Goldman had moved with her sister from St. Peter's, Rochester, New York in 1885. By age 17, she was married to a fellow worker, and by age 18, divorced from him. The feisty young woman grew radicalized by the travails of the Haymarket martyrs. "I devoured every line in anarchism I could get, every word about the men, their lives, their work," she recalled. "I read about their heroic stand while on trial and their marvelous defense. I saw a new world opening before me." Her heart was especially moved by Louis Ling, "You young giant who preferred to take your own life rather than allow the hangman to desecrate you with his filthy touch." Soon Goldman made her way to New York City. On her very first day there, she ran into another young anarchist from Eastern Europe named Alexander Berkman. The word soulmate is used in different contexts, but it is rare to encounter two people whose lives were so intertwined as they still remain destitute. As the anniversary of the Haymarket executions approached, Emma, Sasha, and their friends wanted to commemorate that event, but there was one small problem. They could only afford one wreath. At first, we wanted to buy more, since only Sasha and I were working. At last, we decided in favor of Ling. In our eyes, he stood out as the sublime hero among the eight. His unbending spirit, his utter contempt for his accusers and judges, his willpower, which made him rob his enemies of their prey and die by his own hand. Everything about that boy of 22 lent romance and beauty to his personality. He became the beacon of our lives. That shining beacon soon inspired the pair to direct action. The summer of 1892 was one of the most pivotal moments in the history of American labor. 8 miles to the east of Pittsburgh stood the Homestead Steelworks. They were owned by the Carnegie Steel Company, a powerhouse in the increasingly important steel industry. At the plant were unionized under the auspices of the Amalgamated Association of one of, if not the, strongest unions in the country. The 3-year contract that had been negotiated by the union was set to expire. The negotiations that had begun in February had quickly turned sour and intense. The workers weren't even striking for a raise. Rather, and despite increasing profits for Andrew Carnegie, they were refusing to accept a pay cut. Henry Clay Frick, chairman of Carnegie Steel, unveiled an unprecedented weapon of capital, the lockout. Strikes had been deployed by labor before with varying degrees of efficiency. In an early parallel to "You can't fire me, I quit," it was Frick who temporarily shut down his own plant and fired everyone employed therein. The union would not be recognized, he proclaimed. Going forward, negotiations would be welcome, but only between Carnegie Steel and workers on an individual basis. Tensions increased when Frick began to hire replacement employees to maintain production in the heavily fortified plant. Technically, they would not even be considered scabs, since the union members were no longer Carnegie employees of any kind and therefore not really on strike. Both sides clearly saw the conflict as a proxy for the broader issue of capital versus labor in the United States. This was brinksmanship with important ramifications for the entire country. All over America, people were eagerly following the latest happenings from Homestead, including a pair of young anarchists from New York City. Then matters got deadly. As Goldman later recounted, Frick had fortified the Homestead mills, built a high fence around them. Then, in the middle of night, a barge packed with strikebreakers under protection of heavily armed Pinkerton thugs quietly stole up the Monongahela River. The steelmen had learned of
Can I feel the difference? I don't know about feel it. I can. I'm getting better get better gas mileage with cleaner oil.
Killing a number of Homestead men on the shore. scores of others. To this day, it remains a matter of historical dispute as to who opened fire upon whom. Most sources evade the issue entirely. Inevitably, shots were fired, recounts Britannica. The two groups exchanged gunfire, recounts History.com. No one knows which side shot first, admits PBS's American Experience. What isn't in dispute is that several Pinkerton men and workers were killed and many more were injured. Things had clearly gotten out of hand, but no one wanted to blink. If anything, both sides wanted to dig in their heels even more now that people had died. The state militia was called in, and on July 18th, the town of Homestead was placed under martial law. Politicians reached out to Frick on behalf of the union, not even pleading to compromise, but pleading to reopen negotiations. Frick refused. Andrew Carnegie, conveniently vacationing in Scotland, had also been hardened by the events. Though previously not a particularly anti-union figure, this was now far too much. Never employ one of these rioters, he telegrammed Frick. Let grass grow over the works. Berkman and Goldman hadn't taken Ling's appreciation for the use of force lightly. Blood had been spilled, and men who were fathers that were simply trying to feed their children, had been killed. In their eyes, Frick was the embodiment of the inhuman capitalist oppressor, and the two of them were going to do something about it. How many more laborers had to die, whether at the hands of the state or the Pinkertons, before the workers stood up for themselves? Berkman's thoughts turned to murder.
Hey, Manny.
Revolution was imminent, obviously so, and assassinating Frick would be the spark that finally set it off.
We're listening to The White Pill by Michael Malice.
Clap. First, Berkman tried experimenting with dynamite, but despite Ling's inspiration and Johann Most's guidebook, he couldn't figure out how to make a working bomb. So be it. Frick was a man, and they would simply have to commit the propaganda of the deed the old-fashioned way. Berkman would track Frick down and shoot the bastard. He made his way to Pittsburgh while Goldman stayed behind. 5 days after martial law had been declared, Berkman walked past Frick's secretary into the capitalist's office and drew a revolver. The first bullet hit Frick in the ear. John Leishman, vice president of Carnegie Steel, was in the office and immediately tackled Berkman from behind. Berkman fired again, hitting Frick in the neck. The three men wrestled, and a third bullet went nowhere. That's when Berkman pulled out his knife and stabbed Frick repeatedly. This being an office building, there were plenty of men around to hear the noise. It took several of them to subdue Berkman. As he was taken away, doctors quickly removed the bullets from Frick's body and bandaged the wounds. Frick never lost consciousness and even refused anesthesia, nor did Frick lose his will in the slightest. Before he even left for the hospital, he issued a statement. This incident will not change the attitude of the Carnegie Steel Company towards the Amalgamated Association. I do not think I shall die, but whether I do or not, the company will pursue the same policy and it'll win. And this, Frick was absolutely correct. Not only did the assassination attempt fail completely, it only served to humanize Frick and gain him sympathy. That the capitalist newspapers would condemn Berkman was no surprise. There are no worse enemies of the working men of this country than those same ignorant and reckless socialists and anarchists of foreign origin who make so much noise about the rights and wrongs of our society, of which they have no intelligent comprehension, said the New York Times. But it didn't stop there. The condemnation of Berkman's assassination attempt was unambiguous and virtually universal. During his lifetime, Marx had reportedly been disappointed when the workers he tried to agitate toward violent revolution were utterly uninterested in anything of the kind. They were happy to settle for better wages and reasonable working hours, not full-scale.
I like that he reads his own book, too.
Goldman and Berkman for the reactions to their strike on Frick. Hugh O'Donnell had been elected chief of the Strikers Advisory Committee by members of the Amalgamated Association. His judgment of Berkman's attack was as damning as that of the Times. Thus, it would seem that the bullet from Berkman's pistol, failing in its foul attempt, went straight through the heart of the Homestead strike. Even Berkman's mentor, Johann Most, denounced the assassination attempt. Berkman is my enemy. He is no good. I hate him as much as I hate Frick, and Frick is the Tsar of America. The popularizer of the euphemism, the propaganda of the deed, found that the deed served far more to propagandize the side of the capitalists. Alexander Berkman was only 21 years old, and it looked as if his life was already over. And his biggest accomplishment was to make a sympathetic figure out of Henry Clay Frick. Berkman wouldn't even have the option of martyring himself in prison as Louis Ling did. Though he hid an explosive capsule in his cheek, it was uncovered by the police before he even had the chance to detonate it. Instead, Berkman was sentenced to the maximum term under the law, 21 years in prison. The Homestead unrest proved to be a total victory for the capitalists. On November 20th, 1892, the workers voted to return to work on Frick's terms. The union was found to be powerless and collapsed, not just as a local, but as a national force. In 1891, the AA could count on 24,000 members. By 1895, that number was down to 8,000, a drop of 2/3. Henry Clay Frick went on to live a long, ripe life, dying in New York City in 1919 at the age of 69. His art collection and home would thereupon be turned into a museum, colloquially known as the Frick. Emma Goldman, on the other hand, was left alone. Berkman's imprisonment and what she saw as most betrayal did little to stifle her passion for agitating on behalf of the workers and pushing toward a society liberated from the forces of capitalism and the state. Strongly marginalized, she decided to take the fight to her former mentor. At first, she wrote an article criticizing his repudiation of Berkman. When most ignored that, Goldman took action and brought a horsewhip. At Most's next lecture, I sat in the front row, close to the low platform. My hand was on the whip under my long gray cloak. When he got up and faced the audience, I rose and declared in a loud voice, "I came to demand proof of your insinuation against Alexander Berkman." There was instant silence. Most mumbled something about his hysterical woman, but he said nothing else. I then pulled out my whip and leaped toward him. Repeatedly, I lashed him across the face and neck, then broke the whip over my knee and threw the pieces at him. It was all done so quickly that no one had time to interfere. Disgusted with most and those who sought change through the electoral process, Goldman continued to write and give speeches every chance she could. She paid her way by working at various jobs such as nursing, often under a pseudonym. Of all the people who would hear her speak, one man in particular would have a profound effect on history: Leon Czolgosz. Czolgosz was merely one of the 8 million visitors to 1901's Pan-American exhibition held in Buffalo, New York. The most famous of those visitors was William McKinley, President of the United States. McKinley visited the grounds on September 5th and then returned again the next day. Unbeknownst to the president, and unbeknownst to Emma Goldman, who was in St. Louis, Czolgosz had been stalking McKinley all day. Czolgosz had a gun with her to cast his bullet for a Teddy Roosevelt presidency. Patiently, the radical waited in a long line for his chance to meet the president. When the president finally extended his hand in greeting, Czolgosz shot him twice. It took McKinley a week to die, and for a period it seemed as if he would pull through. For his part, Czolgosz spoke freely and downright proudly about his crime. What started the craze to kill was a lecture I heard some little time ago by Emma Goldman.
I think I got busy.
She was in Cleveland, and I and other anarchists went to hear her. She set me on fire. Her doctrine that all rulers should be exterminated was what set me to thinking, so that my head nearly split with the pain. Miss Goldman's words went right through me, and when I left the lecture, I had made up my mind that I would have to do something heroic for the cause I loved. Just as the killing of several police officers at Haymarket Square prompted the view that this surely had to be the result of some anarchist conspiracy, it seemed absurd that Czolgosz was a lone gunman in the vein of President Garfield's assassin, Charles Guiteau. It wasn't that long ago that Mary Surratt had broken the glass ceiling by becoming the first woman to be hanged by the federal government for her alleged part in the John Wilkes Booth conspiracy. Goldman looked set to repeat that dubious honor. Czolgosz had indeed met Goldman before. He did hear her speak, just as he claimed, 4 months prior. Later, he began to hang around anarchist circles, and his behavior was so odd by anarchist standards, mind you.
I ain't gonna be able to play it on here. Send it to my email.
Spy. The anarchist would have been lucky if that had been the extent of what he had been hiding. Unsure of what to do, Goldman fled to Chicago. She was staying at a friend's house when she heard the sound of breaking glass and then saw a man holding a gun come through the window. Though Goldman would remain a militant atheist all her life, she surely must have appreciated the cosmic coincidence that the officer who nabbed her was none other than Captain Herman Schutler, the very same man who had arrested Louis Ling 14 years prior. Goldman could have made it a point to disavow Czolgosz, to utter some vapid platitude about the senselessness of political violence, to claim that McKinley's family was in her thoughts and prayers, or at least thoughts in this case. All these things she refused to do. While claiming I never advocated violence, Goldman simultaneously refused to denounce Czolgosz's actions. "I am not in a position to say who ought to be killed," she said. "The monopolists and the wealthy of this country are responsible for the existence of a Czolgosz." Absolving Shooter of his guilt, Goldman went on to make clear his lie. "I feel that the man is one of those unfortunates who have been driven by despair and misery to commit the deed. I feel deeply with him as an individual, as I would feel with anybody who suffers. If I had means, I would help him as much as I could. I would see that he had counsel and that justice was done him." William McKinley had been the first president elected in something approaching a contemporary political campaign, with Ohio Senator Mark Hanna doubling campaign fundraising from 4 years prior and outspending the Democratic candidate several times over. Goldman made sure to remind Americans of that fact as McKinley lay dying. "Mark Hanna has been the ruler of this country," she insisted, "not McKinley. McKinley has been the most insignificant ruler this country's ever had. He has neither wit nor intelligence, but has been a tool in the hands of Mark Hanna.
Trash can got destroyed.
Heart or something, but this poor fellow, God forgive him since he knows nothing, is a tool in the hands of the wealthy." Goldman could barely even bring herself to wish McKinley a safe recovery. "What I don't see is why they would make more fuss about a president than anybody else. All men are born equal." If all that weren't enough, Goldman made sure to denounce the arresting officers as well. "I feel sure that the police are helping us," she said. anarchist cause could make in 10 years. If they will only continue, I shall be very grateful. They will save me lots. However, William McKinley 8 days after being shot on September 14th, 1901. 2 days later, Goldman was released from prison. There was nothing the police could do. It is hard to imagine the level of hatred that Goldman then inspired in America. This kid of what seemed to be a deranged foreign ideology was utterly unapologetic, though, being innocent of any crime, there was little for her to really apologize for. And upon being arrested in conjunction with the president being shot, had basically replied, "I sympathize with the gunman, and McKinley's a boring idiot. P.S. Fuck the police." Even Berkman couldn't paint the vapid William McKinley as a monster intent on crushing the workers. Hearing the news from his prison cell, he took a more nuanced, peaceful view than Goldman did, insisting that though McKinley was the chief representative of our modern slavery, he could not be considered in the light of a direct and immediate enemy of the people. He further explained what he saw as the distinction between his act and Czolgosz's. In modern capitalism, exploitation rather than oppression is the real enemy of the people. Oppression is but its handmaid, hence the battles to be waged in the economic rather than the political field. It is therefore that I regard my own act as far more significant and educational than Leon's. It was directed against a tangible, real oppressor, visualized as such by the people. Minstrels would later joke, "Can you tell me the difference between the dew that falls on the grass and the late President McKinley? Well, sir, one is mist from the heavens and the other is mist from the earth." But the time for humor was still some ways away. The fact that Red Emma was free to walk the streets was regarded as a moral obscenity, and something would need to be done about it. The anarchists had taken it as their mission to destroy government. It was a fight that the government had no problem in joining, and a fight that the political class had no problem exploiting in order to further its power. If the anarchists wanted war, the commander-in-chief stood ready to give it to them. Less than 3 months after McKinley succumbed, his successor addressed Congress. Doubling down on the ideology behind the hanging of the Haymarket martyrs, the first President Roosevelt said, "The anarchist, and especially the anarchist in the United States, is merely one type of criminal more dangerous than any other, same depravity in a greater degree. The man who advocates anarchy directly or indirectly in any shape or fashion, or the man who apologizes for anarchists and their deed, makes himself morally accessory to murder before the fact. The anarchist is a criminal whose perverted instincts lead him to prefer confusion and chaos to the more beneficent form of social order. His protest of concern for working men is outrageous in its impudent falsity, for if the political institutions of this country do not afford opportunity to every honest and intelligent son of toil, then the door of hope is forever closed against him. The anarchist is everywhere not merely the enemy of system and of progress, but the deadly foe of liberty. If ever anarchy is triumphant, its triumph will last for but one red moment, to be succeeded for ages by the gloomy night of despotism." In 1901, there were still many former slaves living in America. Yet for Roosevelt, anarchy is a crime against the whole human race, and all mankind should band against the anarchist. His crime should be made an offense against the law of nations, like piracy, and that form of man-stealing known as the slave trade, for it is a far blacker infamy than either. As bad as slavery was, to Roosevelt, anarchy was worse. President Roosevelt intended to stop this anarchist menace, which he believed had claimed the life of his presidential predecessor. In 1903, Roosevelt signed if they were anarchists, beggars, or epileptics. I earnestly recommend to the Congress that in the exercise of its wise discretion, it should take into consideration the coming to this country of anarchists or persons professing principles hostile to all government and justifying the murder of those placed in authority, Roosevelt declared. They and those like them should be kept out of this country, and if found here, they should be promptly deported to the country whence they came. If this be treason, Goldman and Berkman intended to make the most of it. Chapter 3. You can't even conceive of what it's like. Prison had been rough on Alexander Berkman. 14 years in wretched conditions were very deleterious to his health, let alone his state of mind. But in 1906, Berkman finally found himself a free man. In some sense, he quite literally did not know what to do with himself, having spent virtually his entire adult life locked away. Transitioning to anything resembling normalcy would have been difficult for anyone, let alone a notorious political extremist and attempted assassin. Goldman had been publishing a journal entitled Mother Earth to spread their ideology, and Berkman joined her there and on speaking tours. But the youthful fire was certainly dulled, as he realized how much more productive he could have been with his time if only he hadn't failed in his assassination attempt, or perhaps if only he had succeeded. In 1908, the enormously popular President Roosevelt anointed his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, to succeed him as president. Taft handily defeated William Jennings Bryan in the latter's third and final attempt to win the White House as the Democratic Party nominee. By 1912, Roosevelt reversed course, insisting that he had only promised to serve 2 consecutive terms, not 2 total terms. He expected Taft to step aside, but the President of the United States refused. Even a cornered rat will fight. fact insisted. It would be a tough fight, even for the elephantine president. Roosevelt's 1904 election victory over historical footnote Judge Alton B. Parker had yielded him the biggest landslide since the days of James Madison nearly a century prior. To put matters in further perspective, Roosevelt did better during his election bid than Abraham Lincoln did during his. The 1912 presidential election looked to be one for the record books, and it certainly was. The former President Roosevelt tried to grab the Republican nomination from the current President Taft and almost succeeded in doing so. When that failed, Roosevelt made good on his threat and ran as a third-party candidate. Not to be outdone, socialist candidate Eugene V. Debs also made a strong showing, eventually nabbing 6% of the popular vote. Even though he received both a smaller percentage of the popular vote and fewer votes in total than William Jennings Bryan had received 4 years prior, when all was said and done, it was Democrat Woodrow Wilson who was elected President of the United States. He was only the second Democrat to win the White House since the Civil War. Wilson's 1916 bid for re-election would be a much more difficult task. The last sitting Democrat to be re-elected
Stupid people famous for that.
In 1828.
For listening to Michael Malice, White Pill.
Did a good job of mending old wounds and rallied around former New York State Governor and current Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes as their candidate. The outbreak of the Great War in Europe threatened the peace in the United States. President Wilson and the Democrats ran in Wilson's record, reminding the voters that he kept us out of war. It was factual but not truthful. Yes, Wilson kept us out of war, but not for much longer. The 1916 election was a squeaker, with fewer than 4,000 votes separating the candidates in California. In taking the Golden State, Wilson took his re-election victory, much to the chagrin of Teddy Roosevelt, who absolutely despised him. In March 1917, Woodrow Wilson was sworn in for his second term as president. On April 2nd, 1917, he asked for and received a declaration of war from Congress, officially entering the United States into the Great War. Yet Wilson was hardly the only politician given to brazen chicanery. General Erich Ludendorff in Germany knew that there were several ways to win a war. The most obvious, of course, was on the battlefield, but getting the enemy to withdraw or even lose his nerve was also an effective mechanism. The crafty Ludendorff accordingly sought to improve peace possibilities through the internal weakening of Russia, one of Germany's foes at the time. This was an opportunity for communist agitator Vladimir Lenin, who was widely regarded as a lunatic. Lenin's Bolshevik worldview was based on the Marxist scientific socialist idea of the violent overthrow of governments in the name of imposing a dictatorship of the proletariat to usher in communism all over the globe. In 1905, Lenin had taken part in a very failed attempt to overthrow the Tsar, which resulted in his exile from Russia. As extreme as Lenin's ideology was his rhetoric, two mechanisms by which it was easy to dismiss him as being utterly unpersuasive to most people. As Lenin biographer Victor Sebastian pointed out, those who disagreed with him were scoundrels, Philistines, cretins, filthy scum, whores, class traitors, silly old maids, windbags, one of his favorite epithets found frequently in his writings, and blockheads. He often went obscene, and then his opponents were invariably shits or cunts. By 1917, Lenin was thus both a has-been and a joke, but still a possible troublemaker. As historian Edward Crankshaw put it, the German government saw in this obscure fanatic one more bacillus to let loose in tottering and exhausted Russia to spread infection. Provisional parliamentary government had been put in charge of Russia after the Tsar had been forced from the throne in early 1917. Seeking to distance itself from the Tsar's autocratic methods, the parliamentary government did not prevent Lenin from returning. Financed by Kaiser Wilhelm, Lenin was put on a sealed train with a group of comrades from his exile in Zurich, Switzerland. One can't let the pathogen spread throughout Europe, mind you, and taken on a circuitous route back to Russia. They traversed Germany before taking a ferry to Sweden, traveling the entirety of the country. From there, it was a quick exchange to Finland, then part of the Russian Empire, and finally dismounting to great fanfare in St. Petersburg on April 16, 1917, after a journey of 8 days. 2 months later, on June 15, 1917, President Wilson means of revoking her subsequent claims to citizenship. The trial was an open and shut case, with the pair sentenced to 2 years in prison. Nor were the two alone. Many others who opposed the majority of the Petrograd Soviet, one of the workers' councils that framed Russia's halting steps toward democracy. Key to this growing Bolshevik influence was Leon Trotsky, well known for his philosophical bent, unparalleled speaking skills, and historic ego. Trotsky was brilliant. As journalist John Reed famously labeled it, 10 days that shook the world. Without exaggeration, Berkman wrote, I may say that the happiest day of my existence was passed in a prison cell, the day when the first news of the October Revolution and the victory of the Bolsheviki reached me in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. The Russian Civil War had begun. Just like the United States, what would become the Soviet Union was a country founded on a conscious philosophy. While America was based on the classical liberal principles of a property society largely free from state interference, Lenin's Russia was to be a nation where virtually all of society was to be managed by the government in the name of equality and for the total benefit of all. In those early days, everything was on the table. It was a perfect inversion of G.K. Chesterton's fence. Chesterton had argued that if one came upon a fence crossing the road, it must have been put there for some reason at some point.
Only one
it's
of
perfectly
trimming.
possible that the reason no longer existed. But until one knew what that reason had been, one should err on the side of maintaining structures which had once served some purpose. They might still be performing some function, not entirely a marriage. No parent could do as good of a job educating their children as the government could. Indeed, it made perfect sense. The same government was going to educate, if not re-educate, the entire adult population as well. Love for one's children was narrow and irrational, which state educators were not. Why not speculate about a world where women gave birth, returned to the workforce, and had their children raised in a colony by caretakers far better trained in child rearing than their birth mothers ever were? This would immediately solve the unfair situation of some children having bad parents. Assurances were made that in this more equal future, the mother would, of course, be able to see her child if and when she wanted. She only has to say the word. The newfound Bolshevik approach was encapsulated in arguing, as the dean of the Department of Law at Moscow State University later did, that we should not aspire to a highly stable family. Look at marriage from that angle. Strengthening marriage in the family, making divorce more is not new, it is old. It is the same as bourgeois law. It wouldn't be much of a revolution if everyone simply did things the way Grandma did. If things were old, they were therefore inherently in need of being undone in this new society of the future. Not only was the biology of the family open to discussion, but so was the biology of man himself. One communist writer mused that we do not know whether, during communism, emotions will disappear, whether the human being will change to such an extent that he will become a luminous globe consisting of the head and brain only, or whether new and transformed emotions will come into being. All this was, of course, some time away, and they would eventually experiment with a new calendar, too, with the 5-day week. The first Bolshevik reforms were far more modest than turning people into globes, but still entirely radical in their approach, eventually decreeing that all private property was nationalized by the government, all Russian banks were nationalized, private bank accounts were expropriated, the properties of the Russian Orthodox Church, including bank accounts, were expropriated, all foreign debts were repudiated, control of the factories was given to the Soviets, an increase in wages, and an 8-hour working day. Yet proclaiming a new government and actually governing were two entirely separate situations. Extraordinary times called for extraordinary measures. Lenin had explicitly asked how a revolution could be made without executions. In this, he might have been technically correct. It had given George Washington no pleasure to preside over the hanging of turncoat John Andre, for example. But Lenin envisioned his dictatorship of the proletariat as one maintained through violence and a power unbound by laws. On December 19, 1917, mere weeks after seizing power in the October Revolution, Lenin issued a decree to form an extraordinary Чрезвычайная комиссия in Russian, or Cheka for short, for combating counter-revolution and sabotage. What made the Cheka so extraordinary was that it was, just as Lenin said, a secret police with power unbound by laws and superior to them. It was tasked with the power to persecute and break up all acts of counter-revolution and sabotage all over Russia. And since the revolution was defined as being embodied by the Bolshevik government itself, any opposition to it could thereby quite logically be claimed to be an act of counter-revolution and or sabotage. The Cheka took their work quite seriously, working in some ways independently of Lenin, but not shying away from shedding blood in achieving its goals. The Cheka is not a court, the head of the Cheka publicly stated in 1918. We stand for organized terror. This should be frankly admitted. The Cheka is obligated to defend the revolution and conquer the enemy, even if its sword does by chance sometimes fall upon the heads of the innocent. Nor was this new secret police particularly secret about its activities. If anything, its brazen superiority to the legal system was a testament to its power and a reminder of the relative powerlessness of the Russian people. The Bolsheviks' other major priority, however, was to get Russia out of the Great War. Communism was meant to be a worldwide class revolution, not simply a Russian experiment, and warring with Germany was certainly antithetical to that goal, and to the goal of Lenin gaining greater power. At first, the Bolsheviks had teamed up with several other leftist movements in order to implement and stabilize the newfound socialist structure. Their primary rivals were the Mensheviks, Bolshe being Russian for greater, and Menshe meaning fewer, a supposed reflection on the relative popularity of the two groups. Whereas the Bolsheviks favored one-party rule and rapid social change, the Mensheviks had political pluralism and an incremental approach. In addition, there were the Social Revolutionists, aka the Left SRs, a party with an agrarian base who believed in democratic socialism. Finally, and in no small number, there were Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman's comrades, the anarchists. The factions were united against the remaining White Army, those forces still loyal to the Tsar, who were endangering the success of the revolution. In December 1917, Trotsky, as foreign minister, sent Bolshevik agents to the Belarusian town of Brest-Litovsk to negotiate with the Germans. Thinking that the October Revolution would soon cause the workers of the world to unite and lose their chains, Lenin's instructions were simple. String out the talks until there's a revolution in Germany, or as long as possible. Trotsky did his best to run out the clock, but the German offer was simple too. Germany would get to keep the lands it was in occupation of, namely Poland, Lithuania, Courland, and most of western Ukraine. The terms were humiliating, and Lenin's comrades in government were having none of it. Lenin was unsure of what to do, or rather unsure of what he could get away with. Finally, on February 9th, 1918, German General Hoffmann offered an ultimatum. The Russians had one day to sign the treaty, or else Germany would invade. Trotsky had an unprecedented response. He said that Russia was leaving the war, but he also refused to sign a treaty to that effect. The Germans did not quite know what to make of this, or the Russians in general, one might add. The Russians dawdled again. The Germans threatened again. Finally, their patience ran out. In late February, they invaded, and in doing so captured more territory in 3 days than they had the previous 3 years combined. Capturing Petrograd was no longer an impossibility, and if the Germans captured Petrograd, it really would be the end of the Russian Revolution, if not Russia herself. Lenin managed to convince his comrades that they needed to sign the treaty, but General Hoffmann was no fool either. As Sebastian put it, apart from the territory they had already lost, they were forced to give up the Baltic states, Finland, and nearly all Ukraine to the Central Powers, and the ports of Kars, Andalan, and Batum to the Turks. 1.8 million square kilometers, 62 million people, around 32% of its best agricultural land, 54% of its industry, and 89% of its coal mines. This was in addition to an indemnity of 120 million gold rubles. It was devastating and it was humiliating. Lenin was denounced as a German spy and a traitor. Karl Radek had traveled with Lenin on his sealed train, but now snarled that if we had 500 courageous men in Petrograd, we would put you in prison. Some people may indeed go to prison after this, Lenin replied, chillingly and prophetically, but if you will calculate the probabilities, you will see it is much more likely that I will send you rather than you send me. Though the cost was extraordinary, it bought Lenin more time to let the revolution develop. Further, it established him, and to a lesser extent Trotsky, as the person who was in a position to speak for Russia. Lenin had seized power in 1917 under the slogan of all power to the Soviets, meaning the workers' councils who would supposedly be making decisions nationwide. But soon Lenin was saying that all this sentimentality and prattle about democracy has to be cast overboard. By 1918, rival political parties who had supported Lenin's Bolsheviks in their seizure of power began to be made illegal. All power to the Soviets quickly became all power to the Bolsheviks. Lenin apparently never did say the quote that is often ascribed to him, the capitalists will sell us the rope with which we will hang them. What he actually said was far less pithy and far worse. In his view, Bolshevism was a social system based on bloodletting, and the blood flowed from the beginning. This is the hour of truth, Lenin wrote to a comrade in July of 1918. It is of supreme importance that we encourage and make use of the energy of mass terror directed against the counter-revolutionaries. It was mere weeks after Lenin's letter when his own blood would be spilled, for there was an attempt on his life on August 30, 1918. A young woman from a rival political party managed to shoot him 3 times, causing injuries from which he would never fully recover. Yet the biggest victim of Lenin's shooting was the Russian population, for this gave the Bolsheviks a pretext to unleash
cornfields.
On September 1st, 1918, one newspaper urged vengeance. We will turn our hearts into steel, which we will temper in the fire of suffering and the blood of fighters for freedom. We will make our hearts cruel, hard, and immovable, so that no mercy will enter them, and so that they will not quiver at the sight of a sea of enemy blood. We will let loose the floodgates of that sea, without mercy, without sparing. We will kill our enemies in scores of hundreds. Let them be thousands, let them drown themselves in their own blood. As one prominent Cheka operative advised, don't seek for incriminating evidence as to whether the prisoners took part by deed or word in a rebellion against the Soviet government. You have to ask him what class he belongs to, what is his origin, his education, and profession. It is those questions that should decide the fate of the defendant, and therein lies the meaning of the Red Terror. Even Lenin thought that was going too far, but such concerns did little to stem the flow of blood. Less than a week after the assassination attempt came a declaration in Moscow.
It's usually the minimum for the tournaments is 20,000 chips. If you need chips, I can give you chips. We just go to a private table. I've got over 1 million chips. So. Oh, okay, you're good. Yeah, every 4 hours you can get like a free 15,000 just by clicking on your profile picture, I think it is, and it says free chips. Yeah, I think it's like every 4 hours. But if you ever need something to get into, I mean, it's like I said, I want a few, so I've got. Whoa, what is that? A fire? What the fuck is that? Oh, there goes my signal too. What the fuck is that? What is burning? Dude. What the fuck is burning over here? Is it a power plant? Is it just steam?
And even then, it was only to check in on progress in the Panama Canal and to tour America's new protectorate of Puerto Rico. Socialists in America were strongly opposed to entering the Great War. For Goldman and Berkman, the entire situation was absolute madness.
Corn fire.
At its lowest and most evil. The various heads of state at war included the King of Italy, the Tsar of Russia, the German Kaiser, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and Franz Joseph, who was both an emperor and a king. This is who the working classes should give their lives for? Men without a pot to piss in should die so that sultans and kings maintain their hold on power? At least Carnegie had been producing something of value in his mills. The Socialist Party in Philadelphia printed and mailed
Wi-Fi interference over and over again through this area. Just disconnects my Android Auto.
that included the text of the 13th Amendment.
I wonder what causes it like that.
Assert and support your rights, you are helping to deny or disparage rights, which it is the solemn duty of all citizens and residents of the United States to retain. As far as anti-military pamphleteering went, this was as mild as it got, but even such a pamphlet was considered too dangerous to be allowed circulation. The party's General Secretary Charles Schenck was sentenced to prison, with the case going all the way up to the Supreme Court. If anything was to be protected by the First Amendment, then surely it would be political speech such as this, except that it wasn't. The membership of the court at the time consisted of 3 Taft appointees, 2 from Roosevelt, 1 from McKinley.
Jesus, keeps disconnecting. It's getting good too. Oh. Katie, yeah. Isn't she? I mean, isn't part of her probation to where she can't even stream or something like that? I seen her saying something about that the other day. Or yeah, well, not her probation, but her upload or stream bond requirements. Yeah. I don't know how they can restrict you like that. Again, you got judges court ordering people to AA meetings, which is, I think, the most ridiculous thing in the world. I'm gonna go. Yeah. No, I agree. I believe it. I believe a judge said that as a bond requirement. They just think they have absolute power over everything. And look what that magistrate tried doing to Freeman, because he wouldn't put a mask on in a courtroom. Fucking swatted him in the middle of the courtroom. Yeah, well, yeah. Yep. That's why it hurts my heart so bad when you see sheriffs and sheriff's deputies go along with these stupid orders and stuff like that. I mean, they're supposed to be technically one of our last lines of defense as far as the Constitution goes. So it's point that out to a statist, and it's like, dude, how can you support this? Yeah. Thing is, they do have a choice, and it's so refreshing to actually see one once in a while defy the bullshit. I don't know why my book won't come back up. We're getting close to the end of the drive anyway. Oh. One of your brake lights is out, dude. Yeah, I only got about 15 minutes left driving. Right. Well, if I plug it in too, it's directly, it usually stays connected better, but I'm charging something else with that cord right now. Yeah. It's going to disconnect a few times on the way here. We're almost at the detox center, about 5 miles away, so I'm going to end it when I get there. I may fire it back up while I'm working, but no, but they can call it that. If they choose to, and call whatever they want violence. No, I know what you meant. There's personal self-defense. Oh, they're calling speech violence. mean, there's no such thing as hate speech. Yeah, I may think what you're saying is abhorrent, but you know, you have the fucking right to say it. I don't have to stick around and listen to it though. Your speech has offended me. Yeah. Look, cornfields. We have flat cornfields and we have hilly cornfields. Check your privilege. I love it. Give it with somebody, and I know I'm wrong. I'm gonna say that. I don't. Clown pronouns. Clown self enjoys it. Well, we're almost there. checking the wife's tire, making sure she's keeping the air up. Well, thanks for hanging out in the ride. I'll probably stream heading back, but I'm probably going to be here for a few hours. Wife and I may stop somewhere and eat too. We may just stream that depending on where we go. Let's listen to some more of the book later. Everybody have a good one.